Welcome back to The Chilling Chronicles. I'm your host, and tonight we descend into a darkness so profound it threatens to stain the very soul of a town. We're journeying to the deceptively quiet streets of Havenwood, a place that harbored a monster in plain sight. This is a tale of secrets, of hidden horrors, and of the incomprehensible evil that can fester behind a familiar smile. The story you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. It is a deep, extensive exploration of a nightmare made real. Before we unlock the door to that terrible basement, if you find yourself drawn to the shadows and compelled by the mysteries we unravel here, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscriber helps us to keep the fire lit and to continue sharing these harrowing tales from the edge of reality. Click that button, ring the notification bell for all our deep dives into darkness, and prepare yourself. We are about to go inside the basement, where 42 souls were lost to the brutal atrocities of the ruthless town butcher. The music swells for a moment and then fades into a tense, atmospheric underscore. The town of Havenwood, nestled in a forgotten fold of the country, was the kind of place that seemed to exist out of time. It was a postcard image of Americana, a Rockwell painting brought to life with a fresh coat of lead-based paint. White picket fences, though some were peeling, lined streets canopied by ancient oaks whose leaves turned to a riot of gold and crimson every autumn. The town square boasted a gazebo where high school sweethearts carved their initials and a bronze statue of a forgotten Civil War general, eternally green with patina and plagued by pigeons. Life in Havenwood moved at the pace of a meandering stream, its currents gentle, its depths rarely disturbed. Everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. They knew whose daughter was dating the quarterback, which old woman's cat had gone missing again, and who was likely to have one too many at the town's only tavern, the Rusty Mug. It was a community stitched together by generations of shared history, potlucks, and the quiet, unspoken agreement to look the other way from the minor transgressions that constituted local drama. Detective Miles Corbin was not from Havenwood. He was an outsider, a transplant from the city, a man whose sharp edges and weary eyes didn't quite fit the town's placid aesthetic. He had moved to Havenwood 3 years ago, seeking refuge from a career that had chewed him up and spit him out. A high-profile case gone wrong, a partner lost, and a bottle that had become too good a friend had culminated in a forced sabbatical that he turned into a permanent relocation. He was now the town's chief of police, a title that sounded far grander than the reality of overseeing 2 deputies, and a caseload that primarily consisted of teenage vandalism and the occasional domestic dispute. The quiet was supposed to be a balm for his frayed nerves, a place to heal. But to a man accustomed to the constant roar of the city's underbelly, the silence of Havenwood was often more deafening, more unnerving. It felt unnatural, felt like a held breath. His office was a cramped space in the back of the town hall, smelling perpetually of stale coffee and old paperwork. The window looked out onto Main Street, offering him a prime view of the daily ballet of small-town life. He watched Mrs. Gable water her prize-winning petunias, saw the mailman, Tom, make his unhurried rounds, and observed the slow, steady trickle of customers into the various shops that lined the street. Among them was Silas Meats, the town's butcher shop. Silas Blackwood. The name itself seemed to belong to another era. Silas was as much a fixture of Havenwood as the town square gazebo. A large, barrel-chested man with hands like slabs of granite. He had taken over the shop from his father, who had taken it over from his. The Blackwood men had been Havenwood's butchers for nearly a century. Silas was a man of few words, his face a stoic mask that rarely betrayed any emotion beyond a mild, professional courtesy. He was known for the quality of his cuts, the fairness of his prices, and the almost surgical precision with which he wielded his cleaver. The townsfolk respected him. He was a pillar of the community, in his own quiet, reserved way. He donated generously to the annual policeman's ball, provided the turkeys for the Thanksgiving food drive, and his shop was always immaculate, the sharp, clean smell of sawdust and bleach a stark contrast to the coppery tang of raw meat. Miles had only spoken to Silas a handful of times. The butcher would give him a curt nod on the street. His eyes, dark and deep-set, offering a fleeting, unreadable glance. There was an intensity to Silas, a stillness that Miles, with his detective's intuition, found unsettling. It was the stillness of a predator, a coiled spring of immense power held in perfect, unnerving check. But he always dismissed the feeling. It was the city cop in him, he'd tell himself, seeing shadows where there were none. This was Havenwood. The darkest secret here was probably an affair or a hidden gambling debt. The first thread in the unraveling of Havenwood's peaceful tapestry was pulled not by a crime, but by a smell. It began in the late summer, a humid, oppressive season that made the air thick and heavy. A peculiar odor started to drift through the alley behind Main Street, an odor that was difficult to place. It was cloyingly sweet, yet acrid, with an underlying note of decay that clung to the back of the throat. At first, people blamed it on a backed-up sewer line or a dead animal trapped somewhere in the labyrinth of old brickwork and forgotten spaces between the buildings. The town council sent a maintenance crew, who flushed the sewers and found nothing. The smell persisted, waxing and waning with the direction of the wind, a phantom nuisance that became a topic of grumbling conversation over coffee at the diner. Miles and his deputies, a young, eager-to-please rookie named Ben Carter, and a grizzled veteran on the cusp of retirement named Dale Fisher, checked the alley multiple times. They found nothing but overflowing dumpsters and stray cats. The smell seemed to be strongest near the back of Silas Meats. When questioned, Silas, wiping his massive hands on his blood-stained apron, was dismissive. "It's a butcher shop, Chief," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "We deal with meat. Sometimes things spoil. The rendering truck comes on Fridays. It's nothing." His explanation was logical, and his shop was, as always, spotless from the front. The back, however, was a fortress. The windows were painted black, and a new, heavy-duty steel door with a formidable padlock had been installed a few months prior. Again, Silas had a reasonable explanation. A break-in attempt, he claimed, though no report had ever been filed. He'd handled it himself, he said. Miles had let it go. He had no reason to press further, no probable cause to demand a look inside. He was just the city cop seeing ghosts again. The second thread was the disappearances. In a town like Havenwood, people didn't just vanish. They moved away, they went on vacation, they died of old age in the local nursing home. But they didn't simply cease to exist. The first was a transient, a man who had been passing through town doing odd jobs for cash. He was forgettable, a face without a name, and his absence was barely noted. The second was a young woman from a neighboring town, a waitress who had a reputation for a wild streak. It was assumed she'd simply run off, chasing a new life. The third was an elderly man, a recluse who lived on the outskirts of town. His mail piled up, his yard became overgrown. When Dale went to do a wellness check, the house was empty, the door unlocked, a layer of dust coating everything. He had no family to speak of. It was logged as a missing person case, but with no evidence of foul play, the file, like the man himself, was destined to be forgotten. Each disappearance was a solitary event, isolated by circumstance and time, the dots too far apart to be connected by anyone who wasn't looking for a pattern. Miles, however, was a man who looked for patterns. It was what had made him a good detective. He saw the faint, almost invisible lines connecting these disparate events. The transient had been seen arguing with Silas Blackwood over payment for some work he'd done behind the shop. The waitress had been a regular customer, always flirting with the butcher, a fact a gossipy diner patron relayed to Deputy Carter. The old recluse had sold a small parcel of his land to Silas just weeks before he vanished, a transaction Miles discovered while idly browsing county records. These were whispers of connections, not shouts of evidence. They were circumstantial at best, the kind of tenuous links that would be laughed out of a city precinct. But here, in the suffocating quiet of Havenwood, they were deafening to Miles. He started to watch Silas Blackwood more closely. He would park his cruiser across the street from the butcher shop in the early hours of the morning, long before the sun rose. He would see the lights in the shop click on at an ungodly hour, a solitary figure moving within. He noted the late-night deliveries from unmarked vans, the sheer volume of lye and industrial-grade cleaning supplies being hauled into the back of the shop. He saw Silas, on more than one occasion, hauling heavy, burlap sacks out of his shop in the dead of night and loading them into his truck. Sacks that seemed far too heavy to be just garbage. Sacks that, in the dim glow of the streetlights, seemed to have an unsettlingly human-like shape. Miles's obsession grew, fueled by caffeine and a gnawing certainty that he was standing on the edge of an abyss. He tried to talk to Dale and Ben about it, laying out his suspicions, the faint connections, the unsettling observations. Dale, ever the pragmatist, was skeptical. Silas? Come on, Miles. The man's a bit odd, I'll give you that. But a killer? He's a Blackwood. They've been here forever. You're chasing shadows, Chief. You need a vacation. Ben was more impressionable but equally hesitant. To him, like most of Havenwood, Silas was just the quiet man who sold them their steaks and sausages. The idea that he could be something more, something monstrous, was a leap of imagination too great for a mind nurtured on small-town simplicities. Frustrated and isolated, Miles started digging deeper on his own. He spent his nights poring over old town records, newspaper archives, and cold cases from the surrounding counties. He was looking for a ghost, a phantom killer whose pattern might match the strange occurrences in Havenwood. He found stories of unsolved disappearances stretching back decades, a trail of missing persons that seemed to loosely orbit the region, a statistical anomaly for such a sparsely populated area. He cross-referenced the dates with the history of the Blackwood family. Silas's father, a man remembered as being even more taciturn and severe than his son, had been the town butcher during a rash of similar disappearances in the 70s. And his grandfather, the original Blackwood butcher, had run the shop during the 40s, another period marked by a handful of people who had simply walked away from their lives. It was a chilling legacy, a dark thread of possibility woven through the history of the town. Was it a coincidence? Or was it a horrifying family tradition? A trade passed down from father to son alongside the skills of the cleaver and the sausage stuffer? The thought was so monstrous, so at odds with the idyllic facade of Havenwood, that Miles himself felt a pang of doubt. He was constructing a narrative based on feelings, on coincidences, on the unnerving stillness in a man's eyes. He had nothing concrete, no bodies, no witnesses, no proof. The break, when it came, was not from diligent police work, but from a mundane accident. A water main under the alley behind Main Street burst during a particularly cold autumn night. The resulting flood was massive, a torrent of high-pressure water that buckled the asphalt and turned the alley into a muddy river. The water hammered against the buildings, eroding the old mortar, seeking out every crack and weakness. It slammed against the foundation of Silas Meats, and with the force of a battering ram, it blew out a small, long-forgotten cellar window at the base of the butcher shop's rear wall, a window that had been bricked up and plastered over from the inside. The town's volunteer fire department was the first on the scene. As they worked to shut off the main and assess the damage, a young firefighter, a boy of no more than 20, was tasked with checking the integrity of the building's foundations. He shone his high-powered flashlight into the newly created hole in the wall of Silas Meats. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of such unimaginable horror that the young man's mind simply broke. He started screaming, a raw, piercing shriek that cut through the noise of the gushing water and the shouting of the other firefighters. Miles arrived minutes later, drawn by the frantic call on the radio. He found the young firefighter on his knees in the mud, sobbing and retching, unable to form a coherent sentence. Miles took the flashlight from the boy's trembling hand and aimed it at the hole. He had spent his career in the city wading through the filth of human depravity. He had seen things that would haunt most people for a lifetime. But what he saw in that beam of light, in the flooded, subterranean darkness beneath the immaculate butcher shop, was a vision plucked from the deepest, most fevered pits of hell. The cellar was not large, but it was full. The floodwaters, swirling with mud and debris, lapped against a grotesque landscape of human remains. Bodies, in various states of decomposition, were packed into the small space. Some were wrapped in chains weighed down with concrete blocks. Others were dismembered, their parts floating in the murky water like driftwood. Skulls, their empty sockets seeming to stare up at the light, bobbed on the surface. The stench, a concentrated, weaponized version of the smell that had plagued the alley for months, billowed out of the hole, a foul exhalation from the very bowels of the earth. It was the smell of mass death, of industrial-scale slaughter. Miles stood frozen, the flashlight beam shaking in his hand. The silence of Havenwood had finally broken, and in its place was the roar of an absolute, soul-shattering truth. He had not been chasing shadows. He had been living on top of a graveyard. He keyed his radio, his voice a strained, unfamiliar rasp. "Dale, Ben, get down to the alley behind Silas Meats. Now, and call the state police. Call the FBI. Call everyone." He paused, taking a ragged breath, the foul air burning his lungs. Tell them we've found them. We've found them all." The veneer of Havenwood had been stripped away, and underneath was a foundation of bones. The held breath had been released, and it was a scream. The town butcher had a secret kept in the cold, dark earth beneath his shop. A secret that had a body count. Miles lowered the flashlight, the darkness swallowing the horrific tableau once more. But the image was burned onto his retinas, a permanent stain on his mind. 42. He had done a quick, frantic count. 42 faces, 42 lives, reduced to a macabre collection in a butcher's basement. The hunt for a monster was over. The nightmare of understanding him had just begun. The arrival of the state police and the FBI transformed Havenwood overnight. The picturesque small town, once a haven of tranquility, became an occupied territory. Main Street was cordoned off with yellow tape, its familiar storefronts reflecting the cold, impersonal flashing of blue and red lights. Satellite trucks from news stations clogged the narrow lanes, their long antennae reaching up like skeletal fingers towards the gray, unforgiving sky. Reporters, smelling the story of a lifetime, descended like vultures, shoving microphones in the faces of stunned and bewildered residents whose world had been irrevocably shattered. The name Havenwood, once synonymous with peace, was now destined to be forever linked with a litany of horror. For Detective Miles Corbin, the initial grim satisfaction of being proven right was quickly consumed by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the reality he had uncovered. He was no longer the lone Cassandra crying out a warning that no one would heed. He was now a small cog in a massive, churning machine of investigation. Forensics teams in white Tyvek suits moved in and out of the butcher shop, their methodical, almost sterile movements a bizarre counterpoint to the chaotic horror they were meticulously cataloging. The alley behind Silas Meats was now a major crime scene, illuminated by powerful floodlights that turned night into a harsh, artificial day, banishing the comforting shadows and revealing every sordid detail. The process of emptying the basement was a slow, agonizing, and stomach-churning ordeal. The water had to be pumped out first, a gruesome soup of mud, water, and human effluents. Each gallon was carefully filtered for evidence. Then, one by one, the bodies were brought out. Each zipped black bag that was carried from the rear of the shop and loaded into a refrigerated truck was a fresh stab of reality, a confirmation of a life stolen. The number grew steadily, climbing until it reached the horrifying total of 42. 42 souls, their stories silenced, their fates sealed in the cold, damp earth beneath the feet of a town that had gone about its daily life, completely oblivious. Silas Blackwood had been arrested without incident. Miles, Dale, and Ben had gone to his house, a modest, well-kept home on the edge of town, just as the sun was rising on the morning after the discovery. They found him in his kitchen, calmly eating a bowl of oatmeal, the local news playing on a small television on the counter. He showed no surprise, no fear, no anger. When Miles told him he was under arrest, Silas simply finished his mouthful, carefully placed his spoon on the table, and stood up. He turned and placed his massive hands behind his back, waiting for the cuffs. It was a gesture of such eerie compliance, of such profound acceptance, that it was more chilling than any protest or denial would have been. The stillness Miles had always sensed in him was still there, an unbreachable wall of calm. As they led him away, his dark eyes met Miles's for a fleeting moment. There was no malice in them, no insanity. There was only a void, a chilling emptiness that seemed to swallow the light. The butcher shop, Silas Meats, was no longer a place of commerce. It was an annex of hell. The investigators began to deconstruct it, peeling back the layers of normalcy to reveal the workshop of a monster. The public-facing part of the shop, the area where customers had stood for generations, was exactly as it had always been. Clean, orderly, and unremarkable. But beyond the swinging doors that led to the back room, the narrative changed. This was Silas's true domain. The main processing room was a study in grim efficiency. Gleaming stainless steel tables, massive band saws, and a collection of knives, cleavers, and hooks that would have serviced a small slaughterhouse were all arranged with meticulous care. But forensic analysis revealed microscopic traces of human blood and tissue that had seeped into the crevices of the equipment, despite Silas's obsessive cleaning. The large, walk-in freezer, which was supposed to hold sides of beef and pork, held something else entirely. Wrapped in white butcher paper, labeled with dates but no names, were packages of what the medical examiner would later confirm to be human flesh. Some of it had, chillingly, been ground into sausage and mixed with pork. The town of Havenwood had not just been living alongside a killer. They had been his customers. The thought was so vile, so unthinkable, that it induced a wave of collective hysteria and revulsion throughout the community. But the most disturbing discoveries were made in a small, soundproofed room that branched off the main processing area, a room whose existence was hidden behind a false wall. This was his abattoir. The walls were tiled like a public bathroom for easy cleaning. A large drain was set into the center of the slanted concrete floor. In this room, they found the tools of his trade, not the tools of a butcher but of a torturer. Restraints were bolted to the floor and walls. A collection of surgical instruments, far more delicate than what would be needed for butchering animals, were laid out neatly on a tray. And on a small wooden workbench, they found a collection of journals. They were Silas's journals, and his father's, and his grandfather's before him, bound in worn leather, filled with page after page of neat, precise script. They were the secret history of the Blackwood family. They were a logbook of murder. For nearly a century, the butchers of Havenwood had been culling a hidden herd. They were not driven by madness, or by some uncontrollable bloodlust, as the media was so quick to speculate. Their motives, as detailed in the chillingly lucid prose of the journals, were far more terrifying. They saw themselves as caretakers, as stewards of the town. They were pruners. The entries described their victims not as people, but as weeds in the garden of Havenwood. The transient who argued too loudly, the waitress who was deemed too promiscuous, the farmer who fell into debt and became a drain on the community, the outsider whose face they simply didn't like. Anyone who, in their twisted, proprietary view, threatened the placid, orderly nature of their town was a candidate for removal. They were aberrations, imperfections in the Rockwell painting they had appointed themselves to maintain. The journals were a cold, methodical record of their self-appointed duty. They detailed the stalking, the abduction, the processing, and the disposal of each victim. The language was detached, clinical, the language of a rancher culling a sick animal from the herd. Miles spent hours in a sterile interrogation room with Silas, the journals spread out on the table between them. He had hoped for a confession, for a flicker of remorse, for some explanation that would allow the world to categorize Silas as a monster and move on. But Silas remained an enigma. He would not speak. He would sit there, perfectly still, his large hands resting on his thighs, and stare at Miles with those empty, hollow eyes. He would occasionally glance at the journals. A flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Was it pride? But he would not utter a single word. His silence was his final fortress, and it was impenetrable. The investigation became a painstaking effort to put names to the bodies and to piece together the fractured stories of their lives. The 42 victims were a cross-section of humanity. Some were the missing persons Miles had suspected, locals who had been quietly erased from the town's roster. Many others were outsiders, drifters, people from neighboring towns whose disappearances had never been connected. They were people who lived on the margins, people who they thought would not be missed. The Blackwoods had been careful. They had chosen their victims with the same precision they used to choose their cuts of meat. As the details of the Blackwood family's century-long reign of terror emerged, the town of Havenwood began to implode. The idyllic community shattered into a million pieces of paranoia and suspicion. Neighbors who had known each other their whole lives now looked at each other with fear and distrust. Who had known? Who could have suspected? The quiet nods and reserved nature of the Blackwood men, once seen as hallmarks of a respectable, old-fashioned family, were now reinterpreted as sinister omens. Every purchase made at Silas Meats, every pound of ground beef, every string of sausages, was now a source of horror and self-recrimination. The town's shared history was now a shared trauma. Dale Fisher, the veteran deputy, took it the hardest. He had lived in Havenwood his entire life. He had gone to school with Silas. He had bought meat from his father. The revelation that the foundation of his world was built on a charnel house broke something inside him. He retired early, a haunted, broken man, unable to reconcile the town he thought he knew with the abattoir it had truly been. Young Ben Carter was also deeply affected. His youthful idealism curdled into a hard, cynical worldview. The easy smiles and friendly waves of the townsfolk now seemed like masks, hiding unknowable darkness. For Miles, the case was a strange and bitter vindication. He had been right. His instincts, honed on the brutal streets of the city, had not failed him. But there was no triumph in it. He had uncovered the truth, but the truth was a cancer that was now consuming the town he had sought for sanctuary. He had come to Havenwood to escape the ghosts of his past, only to find a town literally built on top of them. The investigation continued, a grim archaeological dig into the past. They excavated the grounds around Silas's home, finding more bones. They dredged the local lake, finding more weighted bodies. The final count of the Blackwood family's victims would likely never be known for certain. The journals were detailed, but even they hinted at disposals that left no trace. They had been operating for so long with such impunity that they had become a force of nature in Havenwood, a silent, unseen predator that maintained the town's peace through systematic slaughter. One afternoon, as Miles was going through the evidence logs, a state trooper brought him a small, overlooked item that had been found in the hidden room. It was a child's drawing, rendered in crayon on a piece of yellowed construction paper. It depicted a smiling stick figure, holding hands with a much larger stick figure in front of a building labeled Meats. Underneath, in a child's scrawl, it said, "Me and Daddy." It was dated 1985. It was a drawing by a young Silas Blackwood. It was a portrait of a boy and his father, a father who was teaching his son the family business. Not just the business of butchery, but the business of pruning the garden of Havenwood. Miles stared at the drawing, and for the first time he felt a sliver of understanding, a chilling insight into the Blackwood legacy. It wasn't about madness. It was about inheritance. It was about a set of beliefs, a worldview so insular and so warped that it had been passed down through generations as gospel. The Blackwoods were not monsters in their own eyes. They were protectors. They were guardians. And Silas, the silent, stoic man sitting in a jail cell, was not a crazed killer. He was a dutiful son, carrying on his father's work, just as his father had carried on his. The echoes in the abattoir were not just the screams of the victims. They were the whispers of fathers to their sons, a lineage of bloodshed passed down with the family name. The true horror was not that a man could do such things, but that a family could believe it was their duty. And in a town that prided itself on tradition, the Blackwoods had upheld the most terrible tradition of all. The trial of Silas Blackwood was a media circus, a spectacle of morbid fascination that descended upon the small county courthouse, transforming it into the epicenter of the nation's attention. The prosecution, armed with the irrefutable evidence of the bodies, the forensic findings from the shop, and the chilling, detailed confessions contained within the Blackwood family journals, built a case that was less a trial and more a formality, a public recitation of horrors. They painted a picture of a monster, a cold-blooded, systematic killer who had operated under a veneer of absolute normalcy. Silas's defense team, court-appointed and faced with an impossible task, attempted to argue a plea of insanity. They spoke of a legacy of abuse, of a young boy indoctrinated into a grotesque belief system by a domineering and psychopathic father. They portrayed Silas not as an architect of evil, but as its product, a man whose sanity had been carved away and replaced with a twisted code of conduct, much like his father and grandfather before him. They argued that he was incapable of understanding the moral wrongness of his actions, that to him, pruning the garden was as natural and necessary a chore as trimming the hedges in his own yard. Throughout the proceedings, Silas himself remained a statue. He sat at the defendant's table, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, his large frame seeming to shrink within the confines of the courtroom. He listened to the gruesome testimony of the medical examiners, to the tearful impact statements from the few families of victims who could be identified and located, and to the psychological assessments that labeled him a schizophrenic, a psychopath, a man devoid of empathy. He listened to it all with the same unnerving placidity he had shown since his arrest. His face was a blank canvas, his eyes two dark pools that reflected nothing of the storm of revulsion and hatred that swirled around him. He never spoke. He never testified. His silence was his final, defiant act of control. The verdict, when it came, was a foregone conclusion. Guilty, on 42 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. The judge, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sorrow, called Silas's actions an offense against God and humanity, and sentenced him to consecutive life sentences, one for each victim, ensuring that he would die in a cage. As he was led from the courtroom for the final time, the cameras flashing, the crowd shouting curses at him, Silas Blackwood turned his head and his eyes swept across the gallery. They settled, for a brief, electric moment, on Miles Corbin. And in that instant, for the first and only time, Miles saw something flicker in their depths. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't fear. It was a look of quiet, profound pity. It was the look a gardener might give a man who could not understand the necessity of pulling weeds. Then he was gone, swallowed by the machinery of justice, leaving behind a town in ruins. With Silas gone, the town of Havenwood was left to grapple with its own reflection. The horror was not just what Silas had done, but that he had done it among them, beside them, for generations. The foundations of their community were not just shaken. They were poisoned. The trust that had bound them together was replaced by a creeping, insidious paranoia. Every quiet neighbor, every eccentric recluse, was now viewed through a lens of suspicion. The town's history, once a source of pride, was now a source of shame, a macabre footnote in the annals of true crime. The economic and social fallout was devastating. Tourism, once a small but steady source of income from leaf peepers and antique hunters, evaporated. People were afraid to even pass through Havenwood. The butcher town, they called it. For sale signs sprouted on lawns like mushrooms after a rain. Families who had lived there for generations packed up and left, unable to bear the weight of their town's new identity, unwilling to raise their children in a place where the boogeyman had been real and had sold them their Sunday roast. Silas Meats, the building itself, stood as a monument to the town's trauma. It was a place of pilgrimage for ghouls and amateur sleuths who would come to take pictures and try to peek through the boarded-up windows. The town council debated what to do with it. Some wanted it torn down, erased from the landscape as if its demolition could somehow erase the memory of what had happened inside. Others, in a move of grim pragmatism, argued to preserve it, perhaps as a museum, a macabre source of revenue for a town now destitute. The debate raged, another symptom of a community tearing itself apart at the seams. Miles Corbin stayed. He had come to Havenwood seeking peace and had found a war. He felt a strange, binding sense of responsibility to the broken town. He had been the one to pull back the curtain, to expose the rot, and he felt he owed it to the living and to the dead to see it through. He worked tirelessly, helping to close the countless cold cases that were now attributed to the Blackwoods, attending the small, sad funerals for the unidentified victims who were buried in a new, segregated section of the town cemetery. He became a fixture in the town's new, somber reality, a man as haunted as the community he served. The quiet he had once found so unsettling was now gone. It had been replaced by a different kind of silence, a heavy, sorrowful quiet filled with unspoken fears and lingering ghosts. He would find himself driving past the old Blackwood house, now empty and decaying, and thinking of the little boy who drew a picture of himself and his father, a boy who had been taught that a cleaver could be an instrument of civic duty. He thought about the insidious nature of belief, how a lie, told with enough conviction and passed down through generations, could become a kind of truth, a private religion with a congregation of three and a doctrine written in blood. Years passed. Havenwood did not recover. It became a shell of its former self, a place defined by its tragedy. The population dwindled. The picket fences rotted. Main Street, once a vibrant hub of community life, was now a collection of shuttered businesses and fading memories. The butcher shop was eventually demolished in the middle of the night by a town ordinance, leaving an empty, scarred lot that everyone avoided. But its absence was a presence, a void that spoke more loudly than the building ever had. Miles grew old in Havenwood. He never returned to the city. His hair turned gray, and the weary lines around his eyes deepened. He remained the chief of police until the day he retired, his career defined by the one case that had been both his greatest success and his most profound failure. He had caught the monster, but he couldn't save the town. One crisp autumn evening, long after he had retired, Miles was sitting on his porch, watching the crimson leaves fall from the old oaks, blanketing the cracked sidewalks. A young couple, new to town, one of the few who had moved in, attracted by the impossibly cheap real estate, walked by. They smiled and waved. "Evening, Chief," the young man called out. Miles nodded back, a faint, sad smile on his lips. He watched them walk down the street, their laughter echoing in the quiet air. They were planting new seeds in a garden that had been salted with blood and bones. He wondered if they knew the real history of the ground beneath their feet. He wondered if any garden, once so thoroughly contaminated, could ever truly be pure again. He thought of Silas Blackwood, who had died in prison a few years earlier, succumbing to a cancer that had eaten him from the inside out. He had remained silent to the very end. The last of the Blackwood butchers was gone, the dark lineage finally extinguished. But the scars he had carved into the heart of Havenwood were permanent. They were in the empty stores, in the distrustful glances of the few remaining residents, in the empty lot where a butcher shop once stood. They were in the very soil of the town. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the long shadows of the evening stretched across the street, like grasping fingers. The wind rustled the dry leaves, and for a moment, it sounded like whispers. Miles Corbin closed his eyes. He had come to Havenwood seeking an escape from the darkness of the human heart, but he had learned a terrible lesson. There is no escape. The darkness is not in the city or in the town. It is in the soil we walk on, in the histories we inherit, and in the quiet, ordinary men who smile and nod and sell us our daily bread, all while tending to their own secret, terrible gardens. The weeds had been pulled, but the roots remained, deep and unseen, waiting for the right conditions to sprout once more. Havenwood was quiet again, but it would never again be at peace.